Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for us to be here with you guys. You guys are our partners in this progress that we're making, and it's an honor for our science team, actually for everyone on the CFF team, to be here and to be with you guys. So we're going to, as Preston said, go about 10 minutes each. And when we were talking as a science team about what the title of this should be, we actually decided on the title Accelerating Progress, because I think it has two different meanings. The first meaning is that progress has been accelerating. This past year has been amazing. As Preston said, it has been the best year in terms of new therapies. Looks like the talk's going on its own here. You can back up a little bit. This year has been as good for new therapies as any in our history. It's been an incredibly exciting time. The other thing, though, is that we know that we need to continue to accelerate progress, right? So it's not just that progress is moving faster, but we know at the foundation and all of us together that we have to be committed, and we are, to accelerating progress faster than we've ever gone before. And so, Paul, I was thinking as you were talking and talking about Stacy, that's part of the charge here, is to continue to accelerate, to continue to build on what we're doing. So let's go, though, through some of that progress from this past year. And we're going to keep it somewhat simple. I was in clinic this past week, and I was sort of struck because there was, and talking to a bunch of different people with cystic fibrosis and their families, there was actually some misunderstandings about sort of what's been going on and some confusion. And I realized it's gotten a little more complicated with these new advances, because before it was sort of easy. For people that had 2 F508del mutations, they could take Orkambi. For people with another list of mutations, they could take Kalydeco. That was sort of an easy one. And there was another group that we were working on. One of the things, obviously, that was most exciting this past year was that the FDA approved Symdeko, and that's the way you say it. It sort of rhymes with Kalydeco, sort of, that approved Symdeko. And this is actually a big step forward for a couple of reasons, but let's just go through to make sure you really sort of understand why it was a big thing. There's one group that would benefit from this, and that is the people who are eligible to take Orkambi before. People with 2 F508del mutations. And so what Symdeko is it's a version of, a little bit better version of a modulator that doesn't have some of the side effects that Orkambi has. The other group, though, is a group who was previously taking Kalydeco. Not everybody on Kalydeco, but 26 specific mutations who are taking Kalydeco, who now are clear that they would benefit a little bit more from Symdeko. So let's go through a little bit of those details. So as I said, that one of the first groups, again, is the F508del homozygous groups. And this group, particularly for that group of people, maybe 15%, who are unable to take Orkambi because of some of the side effects. So sometimes people will get chest tightness from it. This is an opportunity for that group to suddenly have a therapy. It also, a big advance is that it has less drug-drug interactions with other therapies. So you may be familiar with or heard about some people who had a hard time taking Orkambi because it interacted with other medications, like antifungal medications. And this now allows them to continue to take their modulators. So what we think about this is another option besides Orkambi for that same group that can take Orkambi. You know, if it's one of those things that if you were doing great on Orkambi, you don't necessarily switch over. If you weren't able to tolerate it, it's easy. Otherwise, it's a discussion with your doctor about what's the right fit. But this continues to build on these options. The other thing, though, is those 26 specific mutations. These were people who were not on Orkambi before. These are people who were on Kalydeco, right? So they were eligible for Kalydeco. Well, there was a subset of that Kalydeco group where in the trial it became very clear that this 2-drug combination, Symdeko's ivacaftor and tezacaftor, these 2 drugs worked better than Kalydeco alone for this group. So who is that group? These are the 26 approved mutations. This is a group that FEV1 had a larger response with this combination, tezacaftor, ivacaftor, than Kalydeco alone. So everybody that has one or more of these mutations, you only need one of these mutations, we're switching our clinic from Kalydeco to the Symdeko because we know from the clinical trials that it works better. So this would be a continued improvement. I think one of the things that's, 2 things I'll just be clarified here. You only need one of these mutations. And the other thing is that this group doesn't have to have, like I said, it just has to have one of these mutations in order to be able to do this. There's a third part, though, that is a really key part for the future. And that is that Symdeco contains ivacaftor and tezacaftor, which forms two of the three components of what we call the triple combination. All right, so this is the thing that's going to transform the future that Preston was talking about. So the triple combination is a combination of basically it's Symdeco plus another medication, which makes the combination much stronger in terms of correcting CFTR. And so we've seen this figure before, but I just wanted to bring it up again because I think it highlights why this will be so transformational. We know that when people who have G551D mutation take Kalydeco, that they get better, right? We've seen that. That's a great story. When we look in the dish and we look at how much correction Kalydeco gives to G551D cells, it's about 40 or 50%. So we know that if we can get higher than that, or at least at that level, that will enable us to be successful. When we look at what we see for tezacaftor and ivacaftor, we see that it's not as good as Kalydeco, but when we start adding that third drug to this two-drug combination, in people with two F508del mutations, what we see is something that's significantly stronger than even that for Kalydeco for G551D. So this data, or these data, are the ones that are going to actually make it possible to be able to transform CF for anybody with a single F508del mutation, because the key point of this is it is strong enough to treat two, but it's also strong enough to treat even a single F508del mutation. Now, one of the big things that happened this last year is we had seen this in the dish, we'd seen this in the lab, but the question is, what would happen when we use this triple combination in people with a single F508del mutation, just one F508del mutation? Well, those results were released in January, and they were striking. They really told us, hey, we are going to bring this home. We are going to make this. These are the data I think that's worthwhile just sort of appreciating. Again, single F508del mutation. On the other mutation, these individuals had a stop codon, or a mutation that didn't make any protein. So really what they were testing was the ability for this triple combination to be able to treat a single F508del mutation. And what you can see is that after treating, within 28 days, there was a 13% absolute improvement in lung function. There was over a 50 millimole drop in sweat chloride, and quality of life that increased an amazing amount, over 20 points. We think anything more than 4 points is significant. There was another similar trial with another drug called VX445, another different version of the triple, showed almost exactly the same thing. So what this shows us is this is not just something that looks impressive in the lab. We're starting to see this in people that is strong enough to treat even a single F508del, and there's several options. So we know that even if one of them were to run into trouble, that there's other ones behind it. This is one of the reasons why we're so confident and so excited about the future for this group. Now, a couple key things about the triple. I'm just going to say it one more time because it can cause so much confusion. If you have one F508del, it doesn't matter what your other mutation is. All right? If you have one F508del, it doesn't matter what your other mutation is. So that means if you have one F508del, if you have two F508del, if you have one F508del and a stop, that's the group that we think is going to be able to benefit. And that's the way you can get to those numbers that Preston talked about, up in the 90% or more of people benefiting. The good news is, again, this is not something down the road. Those phase 3 trials, that pivotal trial which starts to look at this, has started actually this past week. So we're actually into the trials which will hopefully convince the FDA that this is something that is going to be good for everybody with cystic fibrosis with those mutations. That I put on here that if successful, the triple therapy would be available by 2020, and things are going so fast it might even be before then. I think we're confident that we can get all that stuff done by then. It may even be before that, because these trials are able to be designed to be streamlined, worked with the FDA to be able to shorten those trials up. So I think this is going to be going fast. And I think every time you hear an update, you're going to be able to hear some progress going on. And then as Preston mentioned, part of the other thing that we're focused on is making sure that there's multiple companies in this space, because we want competition, we want to have different options for people, and there's 2 other companies that are moving forward with triple trials this year as well. So, Paul, we didn't forget about you, and we didn't forget about Stacy. Bill's going to talk specifically about this. So obviously this is exciting times, but as Preston mentioned, we're more committed, and in fact we're spending even more energy to make sure that we get all the way. But here's the numbers that we're looking at. If we have that triple, and everything looks like we're moving towards that in late 2019, 2020, that would mean that over 90%, all the people in white would have highly effective therapy. That's mind-boggling, right? Again, Preston said right now only 15% have highly effective therapy, and another 45, 50% have therapy that's okay. 90% with highly effective therapy. That yellow group is another 5% that's going to have rare mutations, and we're going to have to sort of figure out which of those people who can benefit from the triple. And that may be about half of them. That's where that 93% number comes up. And then that last 5% is the group that we truthfully are spending just as much energy as all the other 95%, because we know we have to be digging in now to be able to bring new therapies to them. Bill's going to talk specifically about that later on. And so then I also just wanted to highlight what Preston had said. And we're not going to be able to go into many details here because we're going to do some question and answer afterwards, and we're sort of keeping this moving. But we know that even with these highly effective modulators, that people that have structural lung disease will continue to need therapies, and ones that will continue to stabilize their lung function, to treat some of the scarring and the infection that's there. So a big focus, particularly in these areas, anti-infectives, anti-inflammatories, mucosary clearance agents. I just wanted to mention one because I think this upcoming year is going to be a big year for anti-inflammatories. Both Celtaxis and Corbus have trials that are ongoing. Celtaxis is an anti-inflammatory. We'll get a readout from their trial, their big phase 2 trial. This is a very large phase 2, probably in this summer. And that'll help us decide, hey, is this an option that we can move to a pivotal trial? Corbus has already had their phase 2 study, which looked promising. They're moving to a pivotal trial this year. So we're going to have data this year which will start to continue to inform us of whether or not we can use anti-inflammatories. The reason that's so important is it doesn't matter what mutation you have. So Stacy, other people that have stop mutations or in that last 5%, this is something they could benefit from very soon, as well as some other companies, Laurent and Polyphore. So, you know, I think the last part, I'm going to pass the mic here to Al because we'll keep this moving. And if I didn't cover what you wanted to talk about, please ask it. That we're in this together. I think you've seen the clinical trials campaign that we put out because we realize that this is a team, right? So obviously we've got things that we're excited about. We're trying to look for anything that could potentially help people with cystic fibrosis, and we're trying to accelerate that. At the same time, we know that the team, people with CF and their families, are going to partner to be able to make these trials possible. So thank you for being part of this team. Thank you for all the success this year. We couldn't be more excited about what's coming ahead. And with that, I'll pass the mic to Dr. Al Farrow, who leads our transplant program.
Thank you. Everyone else is so tall here. Thank you, Mike. I really want to take this opportunity to state my gratitude both for the opportunity to speak to you today about the updates on the lung transplant initiative, but also I'm so grateful for so many of you who've provided words of encouragement and support, have reached out to me and shared your stories. It really motivates us and inspires us to really try and fire on all cylinders on this lung transplant initiative. So let's talk about how we're firing on all cylinders. At last year's VLC, some of you may remember, we spoke about how we were looking forward to the Lung Transplant Consortium's first steering committee meeting. Okay, so this is something that we at the Foundation have really built from scratch in an entirely different disease process, right? You think that's crazy, but think about those parents in 1955 who, without any hope, founded the CF Foundation, right? So crazy is what we're all about here, and we're moving forward and making progress. So I am happy to report that we've made progress, and the start really was with getting Dr. Joe Paluski, who is a CF and transplant pulmonologist at the University of Pittsburgh, to help guide us in this thought process and this building of this new initiative about 2 years ago. And in the last year, we hired a director for the lung transplant initiative, Erin Tallarico, who we stole from Johns Hopkins as well. And she has been invaluable in bringing this together. But the important part is that it's not just 3 people. This is an organizational-wide effort. It has required the resources and the commitment from every department within the foundation. And there's so much excitement within the foundation to move this forward. Clearly, there's been a lot of excitement that we have felt from the community. And I have to tell you, maybe it was a little bit surprising to me, the transplant community as well has been so excited that we've entered this field to try and provide some support and assistance. Our reputation precedes us, and people want to be a part of our organization. So, there we go. It really all started with you, the voice of the community, telling us that this was something that was important to you, as well as our programs compass communications, community partnerships, reaching out, listening to the voice of the community, doing environmental scans and surveys so that we can learn what it was that was important to you. And so we started by providing more information and education. So we went ahead and did these scans and found out what resources are available out in the community for people with CF who have decided to embark on the transplant journey. And this is also an important point. Transplant is not going to be right for everyone. And we don't mean to bring this initiative out as saying we're pushing people to transplant. That's not what we're trying to do. But we want to make sure people get the opportunity to make informed decisions so they can choose, so they can tell if this is a right decision for them or not. So we've beefed up our resources at the foundation in regards to this. It's hard for me to see, I'm getting old. As well as provided more CF-specific materials that we're working on. And in point in fact, going back to Joe, we had the first plenary ever at the North American CF Conference on lung transplantation. So if any of you are in need of a Transplant 101 or a refresher, I urge you to go to our website and see Joe's wonderful plenary session. But that again, last year our talk was basically nuts and bolts on transplant, and this year it's more about our progress. In addition, we heard that you wanted more support. And so, as Preston's already mentioned, Drucy and her group at Community Partnerships have established this peer-to-peer mentoring. And there are people who've been on the transplant journey who are available to peer others who are deciding whether or not this is the right choice for them. And there are also virtual events that are being held, such as the Transplant Mini-Con, designed by people with CF for people with CF. And there's one on transplant August 5th, so put that on your calendars. And then we all understand that there aren't enough organs for everyone in the transplant world. It's a scarce resource. So we want to make sure we can help optimize organ allocation, access to organs. So we've partnered with the United Network for Organ Sharing, UNOS, and we have merged their database with our CF Foundation patient registry to see if we can identify characteristics of people on the wait list, those who get to transplant, those who do not, to help us shape the lung allocation score, because many of us in the CF community feel that the present lung allocation score doesn't necessarily accurately predict waitlist mortality for people with cystic fibrosis. So UNOS has agreed to listen to us and have invited us to the table. So this is wonderful progress that's being made, and we'll see if we learn things that perhaps we can improve the lung allocation score. We're also funding research into ex vivo lung perfusion, that's EVLP. And this is a really neat device where you can take lungs from a donor and put them on a circuit and perfuse them and ventilate them. And perhaps those organs that would have been discarded because an initial pass did not seem to be good enough to be transplanted can be salvaged. And now you've increased the donor pool. You've taken a set of lungs that before would have been discarded, and now you've transplanted someone with that incredible gift. So we funded research in that. In terms of research, just a couple of weeks ago, we held a transplant research workshop in Bethesda at the foundation. And not only did we invite people that we've already funded for some basic science transplant research, but we brought in experts who delve into either other organs or even one person who spends her life doing her transplant immunology research on mice and grafting skin from one mouse to another. And seeing these people come together and share ideas and walk away going, hey, I think we may have a collaboration. That's what this was all about, right? I know thinking out of the box is used an awful lot, but that's exactly what we do at the foundation. That's how we've made so much progress, and we're trying to move that to the transplant world. So one of the fortunate things is, even though this is a new disease and maybe sounds a little bit crazy, we don't have to carry the weight here. There are established transplant centers, established transplant researchers. We just need to help provide a little bit of light onto the right pathway, and I think we're well equipped to do that. We're also working on building a biorepository. What does that mean? We want to be able to store samples from people who've undergone lung transplant for future studies to help us find a way to prevent and or treat the number one complication that prevents us from having the long-term outcomes we all desire, which is chronic rejection. Now, we brought together this consortium. What's this consortium? 10 lung transplant sites across the country that do a large volume of CF lung transplants and are recognized to be excellent at what they do. And they have joined together. At first, I have to admit, I was a little nervous that they might not share the way we share typically in the CF community, but they've come together, recognized the shared mission, and are all engaged and invested in making that vision come true. And so they've actually shared their protocols with each other. And they're working together to come up with consensus guidelines on the referral process pre-transplant and on the post-transplant care of people, so that they don't have to be clones of each other, right? They just need to reach consensus and share practices where it matters so that we can move the ball forward with future research. In addition, we heard loud and clear not only from the CF community, but also from CF care providers and the transplant community that the referral process was really frustrating. So we've put together a quality improvement learning and leadership collaborative with our colleagues at Dartmouth, who have joined one of the transplant teams with their referring center, or one of their referring centers, one of their key referring centers. And they're working together to find a way to make the referral process easier for people with cystic fibrosis, as well as for both to be able to establish a shared responsibility for the care of people with CF who embark on this transplant journey. We're also working on establishing a patient registry that is going to really augment our present patient registry with more pre-transplant information, as well as collect more granular post-transplant information. And lastly, we continue to advocate for people with CF. So many of you may have recently heard that UNOS changed the way that lungs are going to be distributed geographically, and they used to be distributed within arbitrary borders within what's called a donor service area of the organ procurement organization. And they've changed that now to go to a 250-mile radius. And we, along with our colleagues in policy, are exploring what this means for people with CF and their ability to get organs when on the wait list. And we will be sharing a public comment with UNOS on this subject. And as well, as everyone knows, lung transplantation is expensive and there are a lot of out-of-pocket costs. And we're working to help provide people with direction as to where to find resources for those. So again, it all comes back to people with CF and their families, and we're really focused on making this transplant journey, if they choose to go down this path, easier with improved outcomes for all. So thank you, and I'll pass it on to Bill.
So thank you, Al. I couldn't be more excited to be here to tell you about what's going on with our research program. And in the brief time that I have in the next few minutes, I'd like to first give you a little bit of an overview and then get down a little bit into the weeds. And yes, there will be data. So we've talked about the progress and the acceleration of progress. And on the right, you see a graph that started in 2013 showing the expenses that we've invested in the medical department, of about $104 million. And in just 5 years, that has grown to $170 million. This is distributed between the research that we do, between the care centers that we support, and the therapeutic development, the clinical trials that we support. All three of those have grown in size, they've grown in scope, and they really are taking the resources that all of you provide and putting them to good use. If we just look at the number of grants that we've awarded, we've gone from 500 grants in 2012 to over 1,200 grants in 2017. Industry programs, these are companies that are working for you, for us, to develop new drugs for CF. They've increased from 6 in 2012 to over 40 companies now working on drugs that will help people with CF in 2017. The number of clinical trials and the number of subjects enrolled have all grown over the past 5 years tremendously. So what I'd like to do is kind of take a look at this now and break it down a bit. Preston talked a bit about where we're putting our dollars, where we're putting our support. And one of the things that came out of this analysis, if you take a look at the size of the buckets, of the areas we're investing in, you can see while we talk a lot about CFTR modulators, and this is an incredibly important area for us, we put $27 million into the CFTR modulator programs collectively in 2017. $41 million into the care centers, $26 million into clinical research. But the biggest bucket, the biggest area that we're investing in, because we know how important this is really CF complications. And we talked about this before. These are the antimicrobials, the anti-inflammatories, the mucolytics to thin the mucus in the airway. This is actually the largest investment that the CF Foundation is now making. And the important thing about this, which has also been said before, is that CF complications affect everyone with CF, regardless of what the mutation is and regardless of what other therapies that you're on. So we think that this area is absolutely critical to maintain health, to preserve lung function, and to help people live longer and longer. So let's break down complications for just a minute. And where are we investing in that area? This shows anti-infectives, anti-inflammatories, mucociliary transport, nutrition, and lung transplant. And I will say, lung transplant might look small, but 3 years ago, lung transplant was essentially zero, or very close to it. So we now have $3 million a year that's going into lung transplant, and that's growing every year in the past, and it's growing in the future as well. But by far, the biggest area that we are investing in and working to support is anti-infectives. We have over 130 programs that we're funding. These are grants, these are studies, they're infrastructure, they're company programs, 130 programs that are trying to develop better antibiotics and better ways of attacking infections that occur in CF people. So if we look at anti-infectives, and I'm going to talk about this because we don't often talk about this particular area, as we're so excited about CFTR modulators and the one-time cure, we don't really talk too much about our anti-infective pipeline. So breaking it down a little bit, we have 90 funded programs that are in basic research and early drug discovery and development. These programs are looking at Pseudomonas, they're looking at non-tuberculous mycobacterium, they're looking at Staph aureus, fungi, Burkholderia. We have 43 programs in Pseudomonas alone, 15 programs in NTM. They're looking at how the mucus interacts with bacteria, how different organisms interact with each other, and how the lung can be colonized with multiple bacteria at the same time, and how all those bacteria interact with one another to cause disease. So we're trying to understand all that biology, and this is a very large effort in the academic community as well as in the industrial programs. But by far, the most important thing for you, for your loved ones, and for people with CF is developing new and better antimicrobial agents, better antibiotics. So I'm going to walk you through our industry antimicrobial programs. These are programs both that we are currently funding and also programs that we are in discussion with companies that we're considering funding or working with them to develop programs, to develop proposals that would be worth funding. And we kind of break them down by stage. Preclinical programs are before drugs go into people. And so we have 9 programs looking at very specific therapies that are in the laboratory trying to move towards patients. And some of these are things like nitric oxide, new macrolide antibiotics, which is a better azithromycin or erythromycin, overcoming some of the resistance which exists for those antibiotics, gallium, calcium EDTA, which is a new type of agent. Both gallium and calcium EDTA are designed to strip bacteria from a very essential nutrient, which is iron. They require iron to live, and these specific therapies prevent bacteria from using iron and therefore kill the bacteria. We're looking at a drug called bismuth EDT, a repurposed drug called tebipenem, oral form of amikacin, which currently is only given IV and currently has severe toxicities. There's a possibility that a better form, an orally available form, could be available. And also a class called neomorphs, which are entirely new types of antibiotics. So these are kind of in the pipeline at the early stage. Once you bridge out of the preclinical area, you get into clinical trials. Phase 1 is looking at toxicity. We have 6 programs looking at antibiotics to determine whether they can be given safely to people. Gallium is in that area. It's a different form of gallium. There's a couple of formulations of gallium moving forward. A drug called itraconazole, which is an antifungal drug, which is being reformulated for inhalation. A combination drug regimen, which uses a protein called lactoferrin and a small molecule called hypothiocyanate, which is together a very broad spectrum antibiotic killing activity. We're also funding and looking at several programs for ototoxicity, which is hearing loss. We know that people that go on antibiotics, especially aminoglycosides, for a long period of time, develop problems with hearing. And so far, there have not been a lot of therapies designed to either prevent that hearing loss or restore that hearing loss. And recently, we've been approached by, and we've talked with several companies that are coming up with brand new ideas to solve that problem and save the hearing while people are getting antibiotics and even restore hearing that's already been lost. Very exciting areas. We're working on an antibiotic called sodium nitrate, a new protein which is called GM-CSF, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and then a very novel approach which is called PAAG, which actually breaks down biofilms and helps a variety of bugs, organisms, become more susceptible to antibiotics. So these are all in the safety phase, trying to understand, can we give these safely to people? Will people tolerate them? Once you get past that phase, then you start getting into phase 2, which is actually saying, how well do they work? And how do we dose them? We have 5 programs looking at drugs that are antibiotics, trying to understand how can we give these to people, what is the right dose, and can we get an early read on efficacy, that is the effectiveness. Icloprim, nitric oxide, has also moved into phase 2 as well as preclinical work, monoclonal antibodies, and we're repurposing a number of tuberculosis agents for non-tuberculous mycobacterium. These are drugs which are either approved or very far along the pipeline, now looking to see whether or not they will work in CF. And finally, phase 3, these are drugs which are at the very end of their development. These are trials which, if they're successful, could actually lead to FDA approval. So inhaled vancomycin, which you've heard about, many of you have heard about before, and another drug combination which we're working with a company on is a fosfomycin tobramycin, which would be a better form of Toby, and hopefully reduce the dose that was required of Toby for that type of infection. So I want to talk a little bit about non-tuberculous mycobacteria. This is an organism that affects about a quarter of the CF population. And the incidence has risen over the last decade, and also the types of organisms that are in this class of bacteria have become more and more troublesome. This is now one of our highest priority antimicrobial areas. We've created an NTM clinical consortium whose job is to identify new therapies, bring forward standard therapies, and really understand better how to diagnose NTM. We've sponsored workshops, bringing in outside experts to help us understand what the problems are. We've developed collaborations with the Gates Foundation and several programs that the Gates Foundation is funding. And we're in the process of developing better laboratory tests. And what's happened in this process is several companies have come to us and we've said, well, does your drug work in NTM? And so there are case reports coming out now for new drugs, nitric oxide being one of them, where people that have been on antibiotics for years that are now put on nitric oxide, which is a gas that you breathe in, that suddenly they lose, the bacterial burden goes down. Some of them are clearing their infections. So very, very exciting, and there are 2 phase 2 trials ongoing looking at nitric oxide. GM-CSF is a molecule that actually affects a certain type of cell in the lung and activates it, called a macrophage. Macrophages are very important in clearing non-tuberculous mycobacteria. And this drug activates macrophages, and in some early studies with a few patients in CF, has shown to now eradicate the NTM infection by activating these normal immune cells. Another drug called bedaquiline has been developed by a company for multi-drug resistant TB, and bedaquiline is now moving forward in the NTM sphere with small numbers of patients to see whether or not it will work in this area. For more of this, there will be a hot topic session tomorrow afternoon, and Dr. Chris Penland will be giving you a little bit more information for those of you that are interested. But not only are we interested in treating complications, we're interested in restoring CFTR function regardless of the mutation. We want to treat everyone with CF, and as Preston said, we want to cure. So there are a couple of different ways we're going about this. One of them is called the Nonsense and Rare Mutation Initiative, where we specifically targeted donations and support to address these types of areas. This area in 2017 had a budget of $14 million. In 2018, we predict it will go up to $20 million, and we have total commitment of over $70 million for the cure and treatments which will treat the basic defect in all people with CF. This involves nonsense drug therapy, mRNA therapy, gene therapy, and gene editing. Just a brief word about our nonsense mutation program. We started a couple of years ago a program at the Southern Research Institute to screen 750,000 compounds. The CFFT lab has been retooling to work towards nonsense mutations. And this is some data that came out of the CFFT lab looking at a compound which was identified by Southern Research Institute and the University of Alabama. And what you're looking at is actually real electrical recordings from cells that express these nonsense mutations, Y122X, G542X, or W1282X. And you don't have to be an expert to understand how to interpret this. If the line goes up, that's good. And so you're all electrophysiology experts now. And you can see here that for Y122X, W1282X, and even for G542X, there's a definite response. And down at the bottom right, it shows what would happen with Orkambi on F508del. So the activity here is as good or better than Orkambi for some of these mutations. So this is very exciting. These drugs are more active than anything we've ever seen for nonsense mutations. If you look at protein, the dark bands are actually CFTR protein. And you can see that with these drugs and in combination with other drugs, we get very, very striking amounts of proteins expressed. So this is very exciting. We're very pleased with these results, but I will say these cells are not lung cells. And when we take these compounds and put them into lung cells that express CFTR, we don't see these kind of results. So the challenge to us now is to understand the difference between how different types of cells, particularly in the lung and epithelia, respond to these kinds of molecules. The last thing I want to talk to you about is really the one-time cure, or where we're headed for a cure for everyone. Gene therapy and mRNA therapy programs. We've been talking about this a little bit, but these are actually moving forward. We funded 2 gene therapy programs using a viral approach in 2017. One by a company, 4D Molecular Therapeutics, and one in TaliBio. And they're using something called an adeno-associated virus, shown here in a diagram. It's basically a ball of proteins where the DNA is packaged inside, and then these attach to cells and allow the DNA to enter the cell, and the DNA is then transcribed and translated into CFTR protein. And both of these programs are now moving forward in preclinical stage. mRNA therapy is a slightly different approach. This is something called a lipid nanoparticle. And you can see from the picture that it's shaped a little bit differently. Here, the RNA molecules are attached and mixed in with a series of fatty molecules with a coat on the outside that can also bind to cells, deliver the RNA into the cells, and express protein. We talked about this a few years ago, and it was kind of in the early stage. But we're really very excited right now because one company that started out as Shire, and that program has now moved into a company called Translate Bio, will be in the clinic this year with a phase 1 trial looking at mRNA delivery to the lung in CF individuals. Why are we so excited? So why are we so excited about it? Well, here's some of the preclinical data that Translate Bio has shown us and has allowed us to show you. These are lung sections from mice that received this lipid nanoparticle by inhalation. And on the left of those pictures, you can see just blue cells. And as you move over, you see more and more brown in those cells. The brown is CFTR protein expression. And it's expressed in every airway cell, and in fact, almost every cell in the lung. So this level of expression in an animal model is one of the pieces of evidence that told us, wow, if this could do this in a person, it could have a huge impact. And so we're very excited that they're moving forward. It's still very early. We don't know if this is going to be the answer, but we feel that there's enough evidence and enough positive data to go forward in CF individuals and see whether or not this will now be beneficial. So I will stop there, and I think this is now the time for you, if you haven't been already submitting questions, please feel free to submit questions to Mike, Al, or myself, and I'll turn it over to Preston.
You know, as I was just listening to Mike and Al and Bill talk, I was thinking, boy, how blessed and fortunate am I to be able to work with the wonderful people that I work with, and they're just a handful of the great people. So I'm going to ask the people who work at the CF Foundation, would you all stand up? Let's recognize you. I think that you are an important team member to this amazing team. So thank you. You know, we may be running a little late, and so I'm not sure exactly when we're going to end, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, Maureen, when we need to stop, would you do this for me? Would you come up here and dance for us? So dancing's good. That'll be my signal. Is that right? Because otherwise we may just go on and on and on. So, no, let me, I have a tablet here. I'll go through your questions. I have some now, but I'm going to start with Mike, since you went first, and just ask you, you highlighted inflammation. We tend to forget about inflammation. So if we had a very effective anti-inflammatory, what would the impact be on lung function decline and ultimately survival in people with cystic fibrosis?
So I think everybody heard that question. Whoa, definitely heard that question. So the real question was, if some of these anti-inflammatories are successful, what would the impact be? I think one of the things that's important to understand is that just cystic fibrosis itself leads to inflammation. If you do bronchoscopy in newborns with cystic fibrosis, even before they have a lot of the chronic infection that we think about, they're already starting to show some signs of inflammation. And so this is something that throughout life of a person with cystic fibrosis, it can actually cause some continued loss of lung function. To answer your specific question, anti-inflammatories probably wouldn't result in this immediate big improvement. We like to see sort of the sexy, 10% improvement. But what it does is it stops that engine that causes the decline of lung function over time. The ibuprofen data shows us that rate of decline can actually be slowed down, but that's sort of it continues to affect every year, year after year. So if you could actually have an anti-inflammatory, it wouldn't matter what type of mutation you have. You could treat anybody who has evidence of this, who's having loss of lung function, and we know that it would stabilize lung function year after year after year. So that's, I don't want to be too speculative, but really that has a chance to actually extend life by years, right? Because every year you benefit from it. It's not just a one-time thing.
Thank you. Yeah. So if I can have my mic on. Thank you. Bill, this is for you. I know there's a study that's growing nasal cells from CF patients that have 2 nonsense mutations. How do you plan on using these cells that you're collecting?
So right now we have cell models to test these drugs that I showed you on the slide, and we can see these compounds working. But we need better cell lines and better cell substrates to ask, do these molecules work in the right cell? Do they work in the cells that are important in the lung and the nose? So the rare cell collection protocol, which was just started, I think it actually got started last year, it's now moving forward, is designed to develop a collection process where these cells can come in to a central facility, which will be our CFFT lab in Lexington, grown, expanded, and then frozen down. So we can use them in the lab if we need to test some of these new reagents. We can send them to the community, to investigators in the community that are doing similar kinds of studies, and we can also supply them to companies that want to develop drugs that will work on nonsense mutations and have a substrate, a cell, that will actually tell them, yes, this is a good drug for the kinds of things we want to use it for, or no, it's not, let's go back and look for more. So we're going to use them as our own biorepository, and we're going to then make sure that this is available to the entire community.
So it's probably, go ahead.
I was going to make one pitch, if that was okay, just to follow up, that study is called the RARE study for collecting these cells. And so if you or a loved one or somebody you know is somebody who has 2 X mutations, there's a study you can go on called the RARE study, which is listed at cff.org under the clinical trials, and you can actually be flown to a place to have your cells collected, and we really, really need those cells to be able to do all the things that Bill was talking about. So we'd love to have your participation.
Yeah, this is going to be critical to enable us to sort of go even faster with these nonsense mutations out.
I'd like to make one other pitch. Bonnie asks everyone she meets for a donation. I ask every transplant program I speak to about what they do with their explants. So those are the lungs that are taken out of the recipient. And believe it or not, some transplant programs don't even know the mutations of the people that they're transplanting because it's not in their space. So I'm urging them to pay attention to this and getting the lungs up to the lab in Boston. But if you know anyone, any of your loved ones who have 2X mutations and are getting a lung transplant, make sure they tell their transplant docs about that.
So Al, I'm going to stick with you, and this is an admonition for you and us. Please do not forget about CF liver disease and transplant. My daughter just went through the liver transplant listing process. They just took this away, but they felt alone when they did not have the resources that you were talking about with the lung transplant program.
Yes. So liver is a little bit different than lung. Typically, people with CF who require liver transplantation tend to be younger than people who require lung transplantation. And the outcomes, not only for liver, but really for every other solid organ transplant, are better in some cases, but actually in the case of liver, substantially better than they are for lung. There's really something very different about the lung that increases the risk for complications. But I agree. I think we actually, through Bruce's efforts with Digest and bringing together a group of gastroenterologists, we're starting to ask ask the right questions to better understand liver disease and cystic fibrosis to begin with, because it is right now a bit of a mystery, a bit of a black box. So it's a good point.
Mike, I'm going to throw a couple at you, rapid fire, so answer as quickly as you can. Right. How soon is it anticipated for patients under 6 years old to have access to Orkambi or Symdeko?
So the answer is that it's different. Remember, so Orkambi has been actually being moved down. Orkambi, those studies are ongoing, so that's probably likely in the next year or so. The Symdeko it's going to step longer, so it'll actually, right now it's approved for 12 and above. The next step would be the 6 to 12-year-olds. That study is ongoing. The typical approach is to step down. That's a long answer after all this, but it's going to probably be 2 years.
So if someone who's having severe side effects on Orkambi, who's older, if they're having side effects to Orkambi, can they go on Symdeko right away?
Yeah, that's the sweet spot. If you were eligible for Orkambi but couldn't take it because of side effects, you can take it right away. If you're actually on Orkambi and want to switch, you stop it one day, you start it the next day.
Did you recommend that all people on Orkambi switch to Symdeko?
No, I think that's actually something you want to talk about with your doctor. So there's 3 groups. There's the group who can't or having struggles with Orkambi. That's easy. You're going to switch them. There's another group who may be flourishing on Orkambi. I don't think there's any evidence right now that if you're doing great on Orkambi, you've had a big response that you need to switch. The harder part's that in-between group. I think that's really a question of you have to drill down with your doctor to decide which one do you think. If you're having any of the chest tightness or drug interactions, then that's an obvious reason to switch.
So we're going to switch gears. I'm going to go to Al. We're going to try to keep these quick if we can. What's the reason UNOS, which is the body that determines organ allocation, changed the radius to 250 miles? Success of transplant, ? Is this a positive or negative for those who are waiting for availability?
So it was actually driven by a lawsuit that emerged from New York City, a patient who was waiting on the lung transplant list on a lot of support with a very high lung allocation score that wasn't getting an offer. And the lawsuit asked that the Human and Health Services look at the geographic distribution. UNOS and the Thoracic Committee determined that yes, these rules were somewhat arbitrary, and we should expand rather than limit the first offer to those within that donor service area. So, for instance, in the case of New York, you could be sitting in a hospital in New York waiting for a lung transplant. An organ could become available 3 miles away in Fort Lee, New Jersey, but because it fell under a different donor service area, you didn't get those lungs, and that was a problem. So they went with 250 miles. We think this or a 500-mile radius is going to help people who are sickest on the list. And the whole point of the lung allocation score is to try and get the sickest people the organs. And that's part of the final rule that everyone had agreed to many, many years ago. So I think expanding it is going to help those in the CF community who are the sickest. There may be some people in the CF community who aren't so sick, and they may wait longer, and that is true. And so we're weighing all of this in terms of what the overall impact will be. But for the sickest people, this is the way to go.
So we're going to go quickly again. Bill, did you want to say something, Mike? Go ahead. No, go ahead. Oh, I thought you were getting ready. I thought you were raising your hand.
Straight in the tie.
Okay. Sorry about that. A little head fake, and I took it. So, Bill, can you provide an update on the initiatives with the Bill Gates Foundation specific to anti-infective programs and the future of clinical trials with these agents?
So the Gates Foundation started a program to try to develop new drugs for tuberculosis. It's a major problem worldwide. They had multiple companies, something like 10 companies or 12 companies with 5 different screening sites, all working together, and they came up with hundreds and hundreds of promising molecules. They're moving these molecules forward in very selective ways, and we decided that since non-tuberculous mycobacterium is related to tuberculosis, we wanted to see could some of these compounds, which are already moving forward, work for NTM. So we met with several of the funded groups from the Gates Foundation. We talked to them. They've now screened thousands of compounds in NTM, found a large number of them that seem to be active in the laboratory. And so some of these are now moving forward through development. But at the same time, there are drugs which are already approved for TB, like bedaquiline. This is a drug that's already on the market. It's already approved. So this gives us a really quick way in, which bypasses a lot of the developmental time to take a new drug and move it forward. So there's both of these things going forward right now.
Thank you. I'm going to, for whoever wrote this, I'm going to change this just to sort of set it up for us to hit it a little bit easier. But I see a lot of funding going into the CF respiratory complication area, but really not much in the gastrointestinal space. Why aren't you doing anything in research on GI complications? Mike, I'm going to let you handle it.
So the answer is we're doing a ton, actually. And this is an area that's been an increasing focus, particularly over the last couple of years. And so I'll focus on a couple of those. One of the, actually, Al mentioned earlier the Digest program that Bruce Marshall has put together, where we started off by saying, let's make sure we get doctors who are gastroenterologists, GI specialists, who can become CF specialists. And so this was a program to bring in expertise. And that's been incredibly successful. As a matter of fact, there's a consortium now of GI or gastroenterologists who focus on cystic fibrosis. They've already writing care guidelines. They're taking on liver disease as well. So that's the clinical care part. But they're also, we had said to them, the next step is we want to have research. So just this past month, that group got together at our coordinating center in Seattle to brainstorm really what's the best next big study the foundation is going to support that's focused on GI. And we've already committed that we're going to be funding that. This is going to be a big multi-center study that's going to look at the most common type of symptoms. A lot of it's going to be abdominal pain, those type of things, which the whole idea would be to develop a scientific approach to be able to treat this. There's also an ongoing work in liver. So there's a PUSH study which has looked at detecting it, but we're actually in talks right now with that same group for now moving to an interventional study using a new treatment for basically helping with biliary stasis that occurs in liver, which would actually be an interventional treatment. The last part I would say is that the triple combination may be helpful in some of these. And part of the study that we're doing right now is a study that's going to be, or getting ready to do, is when the triple does become available, knock on wood, that we're going to be actually study specifically the GI effects and to try to figure out who are those people that would benefit the most in terms of GI symptoms.
Thank you. Bill, this is for you. This is from regarding hearing loss, and our 7-year-old has NTM and is undergoing a cochlear implant on the 19th of next month, only in his right ear. Where are we with these clinical trials for hearing loss?
So we're actually in clinical trials with one compound that will prevent hearing loss. And that's in a phase 1 trial right now, trying to understand how much hearing loss occurs when you get a course of aminoglycosides. And if you can measure that, then you can test whether or not adding this drug on will prevent that loss. An earlier study, which is not yet in the clinic, is actually going in with a very novel approach to inject into the ear itself a molecule which will stimulate the regrowth of new hair cells. And hair cells are lost as you lose hearing, either with noise damage or aminoglycosides or other kinds of damage to the ear. That's not yet in clinical trials, but it's in preclinical development. So I think we have a couple of things that are moving forward. It's going to be a few years before they're actually available to people. The prevention will probably precede restoration.
So I'm going to handle one in the interest of time. So this was a question about the antimicrobial agents coming forward. How will they work against multi-drug resistant infections? And what I would say is that for over 5 years now, we haven't been focusing on any antimicrobials that don't address multi-drug resistant organisms. And they work through a variety of different novel mechanisms of action. There's 2 exceptions for that. One is vancomycin, which has been around for MRSA, but it made sense to us with the rising prevalence of MRSA. And phosphomycin, tobramycin also gets MRSA, and so we brought that forward. But all the other therapies work in a novel way, such as Novoteris, which is inhaled nitric oxide, or gallium, or calcium EDTA, which Bill mentioned. What are we doing for CF CFRelated Diabetes. Who wants to take that?
I can take that, that's fine. So it's interesting. I think there's two different parts on the CF-related diabetes part. There's the treatment part, which truthfully isn't in that much different in terms of the tools as standard diabetes. So part of it's developing the expertise, the guidelines, to make sure that we use the available tools to be able to treat that best. The other part and that's actually ongoing, there's a program to draw in, much like the Digest program, to draw in gastroenterologists, to draw in endocrinologists who say, this is going to be my thing. I'm going to actually particularly focus on cystic fibrosis. We know this really affects the adult population. I've seen the big difference at Hopkins when we've actually had an endocrinologist who's focused on diabetes. In terms of the therapies, one of the things we're really intrigued by is how much can CFTR modulators help. So we've actually specifically funded a project in Philadelphia with Andy Kelly to look at can treating with modulators actually make a difference. And the answer is it can help some, but can really help before you develop diabetes. And so, I don't think that I have something right now that says this is a novel therapy for existing diabetes. Unfortunately, we don't have that. That's going to be probably a general diabetes question. But I think there's going to be a day when we're going to be able to prevent diabetes by treating people with modulators so they don't have to worry about this at all.
Yes, Bill, I want to turn to you, Bill.
So let me tell you a little bit about science fiction, which is no longer fiction. In the pancreas, it's the beta cell which makes insulin. And the beta cells are lost, you end up with diabetes. It's now possible to take stem cells, convert them into beta cells, and have them function very much like the beta cells in the pancreas. So about a month and a half ago, we sat down with a company that's exactly in this space, making beta cells from stem cells. And they want to take these beta cells now and implant them or inject them into people, which will essentially restore the beta cell function of the pancreas. So as I said, it's a little bit science fiction right now. It's incredibly exciting. And just a few years ago, this was unthinkable. And now the technology is developing, and they're going to be testing this in patients other than CF to see how well it works in a different population. And if that works, we want them to come back, and they've agreed to come back to us and talk about how to bring this into the CF community.
Great. Al, this is for you. What are the options for the patients that are needing lung transplant that have more resistant bacteria or non-tuberculous mycobacteria or MTM?
Yeah, so that does vary from transplant center in terms of what they consider what are called contraindications, or more importantly, absolute contraindications to proceed with transplant. So there are infections with multi-drug resistant organisms that people are comfortable proceeding. Typically, the bacteria that people are nervous about, and many centers in the U.S. do not transplant, are those who are infected with Burkholderia cenocepacia. And that's purely because history and studies have shown poor results. But there are a handful of centers, predominantly Pittsburgh, that will transplant candidates, assuming other things are okay with cenocepacia. In terms of non-tuberculous mycobacteria, again, it depends on which one. So most people are comfortable with treating MAC, but the abscessus mycobacterium is the one that many transplant programs fear, again, because of a history of poor results post-transplant. Some centers will transplant someone who grows it, but as long as it's not on the smear, and that means when they look under the microscope, they don't see it, even though it grows in culture, but as long as they don't see it when they look under the microscope, they'll go ahead and proceed with transplant. So really the question, it varies from center to center, but some centers don't do it because they're concerned that the outcomes after the transplant will be poor.
So just to follow up on that, just for clarification, that Mycobacteria abscessus is the one that we would prefer patients not have, more so than avium. So I'm going to go to Mike for two quick ones, and then Bill, I'm coming to you. If my 20-year-old CFer has PFTs above 100%, is it worth to go on a CFTR modulator?
This is a great question. I think this is one of the things we want to think about what our vision is. Our vision is to prevent the disease. And so, if what I usually do in that scenario, I've had this exact discussion with people, is I usually say, look at a CT scan or look at something that says, do you have evidence of any active disease? And then my tendency is to say, yes. You want to treat things before you have trouble. We don't want to be waiting until we start to say, oh, look, you've developed a scarring. Now we're going to treat you. So it was a little bit of a long answer. There's a lot of discussion. Insurance companies are another issue. But we want to prevent the disease. We don't want to wait till we're having problems. And eventually, hopefully, everybody will be on therapies before they have any problems.
So we'll come back to you, but I'm going to go to Bill now. In gene and mRNA therapies, will there be a one-size-fits-all treatment for all mutations? Will a different therapy be needed for each mutation? And maybe you could expand that to gene editing as well.
So that's a good question. Right now, we think that it doesn't matter which mutation you have. If you replace the DNA or replace the RNA or even edit the DNA, you will restore CFTR function. That's where we are today. But we haven't yet tested different mutations for this process. So we think this will be a one-size-fits-all if we can get it into the lung and eventually into the liver and the GI tract and the pancreas, that we will be able to really cure this disease. There may be some surprises along the way, and we're just going to have to move forward and then learn from the data and the information as it comes in. But right now, it probably will, we think of these as mutation agnostic, that will help benefit any mutation across the board.
So I'll take this one because I'm not sure you all were around when this came up before, but is phage therapy a bacteriophage therapy a focus of research for all the grants that have been awarded or may be awarded in the future? You can talk about, there are research grants, I think, but we have funded biocontrol, which became Amplify, which you're seeing in the news now in the past. We do expect that they are focused on both Staph aureus and Pseudomonas. It is an interesting approach for antimicrobials, and we're keeping our eyes on it. And the interesting thing about phage therapy is that it's strain specific. And so you have to be able to address all the multiple strains, and there's a bunch of them for each of the different bacteria. So that would be the limiting factor, but it is something that we're tracking. And Bill, do we have any phage research grants?
We do have several phage research grants, and one of the issues, as Preston said, is strain specific. It's also a foreign virus. So there's a possibility that as you treat a bacteria with a phage, you develop an antibody response against the phage itself. So there's several things. Phage therapy sounds great. There's several issues that need to be worked out before it becomes a reality, especially for people with CF that have chronic infections.
So I'm going to ask Mike this. Vertex has set a very high bar for entry. I'm going to read into this, for entry of other companies into the CF space, because they're going to control roughly 95% of the population. How can the foundation ensure that competitors stay in the game? It's a great question.
It's a great question, and it's a really important one. We've had multiple conversations on this, including one yesterday with a company for a couple of hours. And the bottom line is this is something that is absolutely essential and that we've actually already been working on. That the nice thing is that one of the ways to do this is by working with regulatory agencies. And the FDA also really wants to keep options open to be able to have other companies in this space. So what's going to happen is the trials are going to look different. So in the past, you would see these trials that were 6 months compared to placebo. And they would be long, and then you'd say, okay, now we're ready to add this on. What's going to happen in the future, and is already starting to see this, is they're going to be shorter periods because we can't treat people with placebo for long periods of time, so we don't want to. But they may be short periods to be able to assess or comparisons to existing therapy. I might actually mention right here, one of the things that we've tried to do in trying to build out our science team here is actually to gain expertise to address these exact type of questions. We have I mentioned maybe two new members of our team that have, so one of them is Dr. Tony Dermowitz from the FDA. I think I saw Tony over there somewhere, who's joined our medical team to help with this exact type of things. And obviously, he's a scientist. He's a background as a pulmonary physician, so he's going to help with that. But he has expertise for the last 10 years of working with the FDA, led a lot of these decisions in the past. So I think his expertise we're really excited about. And then while we're mentioning new people, do you want to mention Ann?
So we've talked a little bit about antibiotics in our antibiotic program. We brought in someone called Ann Field, who's had a long career in industry at a biotech company and a pharmaceutical company. And she's really helping us organize, oversee, and really expand our antimicrobial program. So I know Anne was here. She was at the research table in the little table area. So if you see her, say hello, ask her questions. Terrific addition to the team. We're absolutely delighted to have her.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, just to make sure to completely.
You were going to give me another head fake, weren't you?
No, exactly. I was just during the time. I just want to make clear that we're going to be able to do those trials, and that's something that's at the top of our list, is being able to enable those.
So I will loosely handle this. I'm sorry that Bruce Marshall isn't up here, but the question is, as a follow-up, what research are you doing about sinus issues? Sinus disease is a very significant problem in CF, including post-transplant as a complicator. And so what Dr. Marshall is doing, and you'll hear from Bruce tomorrow, is he's building a consortium, a team of people who take care of sinus disease to sort of look at what is best practice for sinus disease, how can we improve outcomes, what's this research that needs to be done, how can we intervene and improve the outcomes for sinus disease. We hope that, particularly with improving CFTR modulators, we'll be able to aggressively address what looks like an unaddressable problem now with eradicating sinus disease. Do you all want to add anything? Otherwise, I'll quickly go.
No, that's spot on. We're bringing together a group to write guidelines, and we're
I should
also.
have let you handle this, should I?
That's okay. So we're bringing a group together that are going to write guidelines, start to think about the important questions and how to address them, and what are the appropriate interventions for people with chronic sinus disease. And that affects almost everybody with CF. So this is a very important topic and a great question.
So Mike, how do people with rare mutations find out more information specific to their situation or their mutation, and what clinical trials may be right for them?
Okay, so I think there's two different type of questions there. I guess they're asking about rare mutations, and one of those would be which trials? The clinical trials. I see. Okay, what I would hopefully you've seen the clinical trial finder at cff.org. We actually, when we put those descriptions in there, we list the mutations. So that it's just going to cff.org/find. You can actually pull up and actually look through those different trials, look at the description. That's one way to do it. I would also say if it's particularly rare, you want to talk with your own doctor, right? Because sometimes it's a little bit hard. They can help you to translate through some of that. There are some rare mutations that are included, particularly if you have a single F508del. If you're two rare mutations, then you really want to probably talk with your doctor, work through some of those, and we'll help figure it out.
Okay, great. We're running out of time, and Maureen is getting ready to come up and dance, I'm afraid. How can new CF-specific read-through agents make it into clinical testing with such small patient populations? I can just tell you that we would love to have that problem. We don't see it as a problem. We'll be able to address that. And not only will these read-through agents ultimately be effective, we hope, for people with CF, but there's 7,000 other rare disorders that we hope that we will provide the way forward for them. For those that, that have nonsense mutations, accounting for their other rare disease, it will be able to help them with these new drugs as well.
People ready to go in those trials.
Yeah.
Laura Gordon, I'm looking at you. And Stacy, I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a quick one, and I probably should boot this to my colleague, Dr. Drusy Borowitz. Have there been any drug studies showing any improvement repairing the pancreas, causing the need for less pancreatic enzymes? There's a lot in this front. First of all, the CFTR modulators. Mike could speak to this. I'll do it quickly. That if you start them earlier enough, there's a marker that shows you the health of the pancreas, that it seems that we are able to rescue a lot of the function of people who are younger with CF when we put them on these CFTR modulators. So that's why I said earlier that hopefully if we start at 2 weeks of age, they may never need pancreatic enzymes at all. But stem cell research is something that we keep in the back of our mind to help with this as well for those that have already lost their enzyme. The last question goes to Mike. Mike, you've got 15 seconds to answer it. Regarding taking Kalydeco, what if your absorption, digestion is so bad that you're not absorbing Kalydeco adequately? Is there any hope for that? It's a tough question. I saved it for the last.
Yeah, so I guess I would really need to know the details there. Remember, there's different ways of trying to increase absorption of Kalydeco. One of those big things is actually by your fat absorption. So taking extra fat, taking enzymes may actually help. I guess I would like to understand some of the details there about it. Really is a malabsorption issue. Is there bacterial overgrowth? Is there something else that's contributing to that malabsorption? So I don't know if I have the perfect answer, but I would treat those things, make sure you have enough fat, taking some of the enzymes. Maybe you have a better answer, but that's...
No, I think I do have a better answer, and that is you've just volunteered to talk with whoever asked that question.
Yeah, that's how it's going to go.
So thank you all for your great questions.